Good morning. So first of all, thank you for being here for this cozy and pretty small workshop. And the aim is to have a brainstorming on policies, environmental policies, see the effects of policies on innovation and on methodologies. We have theoretical papers, empirical papers, and integrated disciplines as well, which is one of the objectives of this new project that I have to mention, because the project behind this new center, which was created 2 months ago, derives from special funds the department received from the ministry, and thanks to the special funds we are able to organize events, so that's worth mentioning. So this is the new center that has a focus on the circular economy and innovation, but okay, we in the project we do have a specific emphasis on integration of disciplines, so economics, business, statistics, maths, and the first embryonic idea was maybe of this event coming from econometrics. Antonio Musolesi invited Hervé Cardot. We're staying here for a week, and out of that, I mean, we invited other people, and we are here. Just 1 minute to say that I leave the floor to Professor Simone Borghesi, who is by definition the first speaker. Okay. Okay, that's it is the only option we had. I mean, so no, just to tell you that I wasn't driving back yesterday when after the dinner, and I was thinking, now that we are getting a bit old, we met for the first time in 21 years ago. Yeah, it was late June 1998. I was a master student still at UCL. Was writing my thesis under supervision of Timothy Swanson and David Pierce, and we met in Venice for the first World Congress. That's of environmental economics and
Was it? Yeah. Okay. Was it you? I can't remember now.
Yeah.
You changed so much, Massimiliano.
Yeah. So yeah, and the funny thing is that I saw I was driving from Venice to Udine, and in the same day I met the family of my wife. So I met Simone BORGHESI and the family of my wife the same day. So that's
okay, there is no correlation.
Okay, so I'll leave the floor to Simone. And the slides are... Okay, 25 minutes. I mean, we are pretty relaxed in terms of time, but in order to have a discussion, okay, that's okay. And then it's pretty old technology here, yeah, but vintage technology. Okay, we are perfect.
All right. Thank you, Massimiliano, for the nice presentation, the good memories, and all the rest. And so, as Massimiliano was saying, we will have a mixture today of papers with different approaches. and I decided to go for the theoretical approach to start with, so presenting a theoretical model that we entitled, Should I Stay or Should I Go? And since we are talking about memories, for those who are not so young, or let's say young in a different way, that was the title of, thank you, that was the title of a famous song in the 80s by this group, The Clash. And the four guys over there look very much from the 80s, I would say, and are not the authors of the paper. We are four, but we are not the compact rock group. We are the compact ETS group, if you want, in the sense that we fight to understand the functioning of the ETS. And that's what the paper is about, actually. We are trying to understand ETS and its consequences, and because the emission trading schemes, that's what ETS stands for, have gained increasing importance over the years. Starting from the European one, that beginning in 2005, spread in many other countries or regions of the world, like California, Quebec, the eastern part of the US with a so-called RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, New Zealand, China that is going for a national ETS now, and so on and so forth. They have doubled the number of ETS over the years. In a few years, now there are 21 operating in the world, and they cover 15% of global emissions, more or less. So given the increasing importance of this instrument, there is an increasing and growing body of the literature that looks at the effects of ETS. And in this case, we are particularly interested in their effects, the effects of ETS, on low carbon innovation and on carbon leakage. There are some surveys that look at the effects of the ETS on several aspects. And among them, I quote just two. There is a nice survey by Martin in 2015 on, let's say, the early studies, and more recently with my team at the Florence School of Regulation, and among them, Francesco gave an important contribution. We studied in an assessment report, we studied the effects of the ETS, of the European ETS in that case, on several aspects, including innovation and carbon leakage. What the literature finds is that in general, there is mixed evidence. There is no consensus on the effects of ETS. The literature generally tends to conclude that there is at most a weak effect of the ETS on innovation and no effect on carbon leakage. But this is not necessarily true, in the sense that new studies start finding new effects, and on top of that, since it's a relatively new literature, results show up as the data increase, improve. So I think it's important to keep studying this topic, because we might have some new results as time goes by. I keep doing with it. That direction. Let's see. Okay, no, never mind. So just a brief, no, but it's okay. Just a brief reference to the literature. The literature has evolved with different approaches. We can distinguish qualitative analysis based on managerial interviews, quantitative analysis based on econometric studies, theoretical models. The early studies were mainly based on simply interviews of the managers and to see what was their feeling about the ETS. Then, as I said, as time goes by, more data were available and quantitative analysis became more and more rigorous. And here I mentioned just a few. It's a selection of many studies existing, but just to give a flavor of what I was saying before, for instance, the last two studies, the one by Koch and Bassemama, and one by myself, Giovanni Marin, and Chiara Franco, find that ETS might have an effect on carbon leakage in Germany in the first case and in Italy in the second case. So just to show that things might be a bit different from what we were expecting. But in this presentation, I will focus on the theoretical framework. I will try to give a theoretical framework to study the ETS. There have been a few studies doing that. Here I mentioned a few ones. They generally try to look at the strategic behavior of the firms regulated by the ETS. And this was the starting point of the idea, especially a sentence by Grab that I liked. Grab, when describing the literature and comparing the empirical and the theoretical studies, says findings are at odds with classical theory, but consistent with theories of behavioral economics. And that's where we start from, trying to build up a behavioral model, so to speak, not in the sense of doing experimental economics, but in the sense of studying the behavior of the agents that are subject to the ETS. So for this purpose, we use an evolutionary approach. By this, evolutionary game dynamics, we mean using theoretical game models to study the evolution of a population of firms, how the population evolves, what are the dynamics characterizing that population. Population that is characterized by agents that are characterized by bounded rationality and imitative behaviors. So in a non-mainstream approach, so to speak. And what we do is to study the functioning of the ETS and the impact on the incentive to delocalize and the diffusion of eco-innovation in the presence of three interactive populations of firms that act strategically. What I'm going to present builds upon and tries to extend a couple of works that I've done with my colleagues, Angelo Antoci and others. The first one on the incentive to make eco-innovation in an ETS with a floor price, so with the presence of a minimum price. And the second on the incentive to cheat, in other words, to be non-compliant in an ETS with sanctions. So studying what strategy the firms might adopt in front of the ETS. Just to give you an idea of the present case, we can use a very simple decisional tree to illustrate what we have in mind. When a firm is regulated by the ETS, it has two options at disposal, either stay or leave. And that's why the title, Should I Stay or Should I Go? I can decide to stay and be regulated by the ETS. And in that case, I have two options. I can decide to innovate and adopt a clean technology, so to set free from the need to buy pollution permits and possibly get a comparative advantage of the others, or simply keep using the dirty technologies, do not innovate, and in that case, buy the pollution permits. Alternatively, I can decide to leave, and in that case, I don't need to buy anything. And that's what carbon leakage is about. Obviously, a small footnote, when I say leave, I mean I leave towards a non-ETS country. So a country that is not regulated by the ETS. It makes no sense to move to another ETS unless the price is lower than mine. But we will focus on a very simple dichotomic choice. ETS or non-ETS, stay or live. Then it can be extended and adapted to other situations. So with this in mind, we built up, as I said, a three-population model where the three population firms produce a homogeneous good. We have three firms, NP, non-polluting firms that are basically clean firms, and so they do not need permits to operate. P firms, P stands for polluting firms, that are polluting but are compliant, so they stay at home and buy the permits that are needed to operate. And PP firms, if you want, are very polluting, that's why they double P, because they use polluting technology and move their production somewhere else where there is no regulation, basically, no ETS. And so these are the carbon leakage firms. We will indicate with M, N, and S the number of each kind of firm. As usual, go wrong. Okay. Each of these firms has a payoff function that is very simple. Revenues minus costs. And here it would be nice to have just a second. Okay, revenues minus cost. The revenues are made up of, obviously, of price time quantities. Since it's an homogeneous good, they have the same price and the different amount of quantities produced. The costs are made up of fixed and variable cost. That are assumed to be, the variable costs are assumed to have a quadratic form. Now, the NP firms, the clean firms, don't have other elements in their equation. The P firms have to buy permits, so they have to subtract on the cost side the price of the tradable permits, PT, times the quantity they produce, because we assume there is a one-to-one relationship between the amount of dirty pollution they produce and the number of permits they need to operate. PP firms don't have to buy tradable permits, so they don't have this element, but they have to delocalize, and they have a cost of delocalization T, which we assume to be a fixed cost. The cost of moving abroad, a sort of sunk cost when you decide to leave the country and operate in a different country. Prices. We have two goods, basically, or two markets, the markets of the homogeneous good and the markets of tradable permits. And these are the price of the homogeneous good and the price of the permits. The price of the homogeneous good is simply a standard downward sloping curve where P bar is the willingness to pay for the good, so the maximum price, the vertical intercept of the demand curve, minus A times, this is the aggregate production, so the sum of what is produced by all firms, QNP, QP, QPP, times the number of firms that produce that amount. The permits price is given by this equation where P bar T is the minimum price set on the market for tradable permits. And this price is then increased by the number of polluting firms that exist. And so that by the demand of tradable permits created by polluting firms. Notice that P bar, which is the minimum price, can be larger or equal to 0, in the sense that we consider both ETS that have a floor price, the case in which P bar T is positive, and cases in which the ETS has no floor price, like the European one. The EU ETS has no floor price, and so in that case, P bar T equals 0. Although, let's say, there's no explicit floor price. There is, in my view, an implicit floor price. And also notice that each firm maximizes its own profits, taking both P and PT as exogenous given. So we are assuming that there is perfect competition on the output price, on the output market, and on the permits market. So with this characterization in mind, we then move to the dynamic system, so to the intertemporal evolution of each kind of firm. And we assume this formalization, very simple formalization, in which the dynamics of one kind of firm, say the M firms, the clean firms, is equal to the number of clean firms times their profits. And the same applies to the other firms. This very simple formalization simply tells that if profits of one kind of firm are positive, M dot in this case becomes positive. So if the strategy is profitable, new firms enter the market, mimic the others, and so become the number of clean firms increases. If the strategy is not profitable, so if pi is negative, obviously the number of clean firms decreases. That's everything it says, which implicitly says also that we are assuming no entry or exit barriers. So there is perfect competition, but also contestable markets. Everybody can simply enter or exit the market. From this simple dynamic system, we derive the following property. Consider this equation, the first line. If pi and p is larger than pi p and both are larger than 0, the growth rate of m is larger than the growth rate of n, which is very intuitive. If being clean is more profitable than being dirty, then but they are both positive, both profitable, the number of clean firms increases faster than the number of dirty firms. If they are both negative, so both strategies are non-profitable, the worse strategy disappears more rapidly than the alternative strategy. So as you see, it's a very simple and intuitive framework. Okay, I should go down. So with this framework in mind, we then compute the first order conditions. And as you see, we use Kuhn-Tucker conditions to allow for the possibility that firms do not produce, to have corner solutions. And we compute the equation of the plane that separates two regions. The one in which QP is positive, above the plane, and the one in which QP is 0. So basically, there is an area in which firms, dirty firms exist and produce. And so if you want, the pollution permis market exists. And the area below where they do not produce, they do not exist. I'll skip the math, but just to let you know that what we do as a procedure, we find the optimal solution, the optimal values of each kind of firm, QP bar, QP star, Q double P star, and QNP star, when QP is positive. When below the plane QP is 0, we obviously don't have QP star, so we have only two optimal values, the two beasts at the end of the slide. Then we compute, or we analyze the possible situations at disposal. And here is the interesting result. We find that the three types of firms can coexist at equilibrium only for a specific value of the cost of delocalization. So basically, they do not coexist, okay? Because this is a specific value, which means they will coexist with probability 0. In all the other cases, we find that only two types of firm can coexist, namely NP and NP, comma, P, or P, comma, PP. So clean and dirty but compliant, which means there is no carbon leakage. The number of S is 0, or dirty, the stay at home, and dirty, the go abroad, which means without clean firms, M being 0, which is, if you want, the worst case scenario, because then all firms will be dirty, whether at home or abroad, which is not exactly what we would like to see as a result, I guess. To give you an idea of the results, I selected two ways of visualizing these results. consider the cube on the left first. This is the case without carbon leakage firms. It's a cube because we have M, N, and S, the three kind of firms. And the dots that you find in the cube represent all the possible stationary states. We indicate with a full dot the attractors, so those dots that are reached by the dynamics. With an empty dot, the repellers, those dots from which the dynamics, the trajectories live, and with a square, the saddle points. One trajectory enter and one exiting. What is interesting in here is that the attractor P6 is the only full dot, which means wherever you start from, you will end up there. So it is the only attractor that you have in this case. And as you see, the attractor occurs for the attractors occurs when there are no carbon leakage firms. So when S equals 0. So basically the point P6 lies on the ground, if you want, of the cube. On the right side, I represented a cube for the coexistence case. I know that this is probabilistic, very unlikely, but I think it's interesting anyway, because what is interesting is the result that we find. Within the cube, you will see there is a segment, I can't read, P4, P6, exactly, which is made up of attractors itself. So basically, every point along the segment is an attractor, which means that it is very unlikely that you have a coexistence. But if it does, then you don't know where you will end up. You may end up on any point along the segment. So it's kind of, so to speak, a global indeterminacy results in that case. And obviously you can tell that you have the coexistence of three firms because the segment is inside the cube. And inside the cube, you have M, N, and S all being positive, strictly positive. These are two phase plane, and then another diagram that I wanted to show, a very intuitive one again, is the intercept of the permit demand function. Again, consider the diagram on the left. Here you have PT bar on the horizontal axis, which recall is, say, the auction price, the minimum auction price, okay, the price floor of the tradable permits. M and S and N on the vertical axis. So what is this diagram simply tells you is that when the price floor increases, the number of dirty firms decreases and the number of clean firms increases, which is absolutely intuitive. Because obviously, if it's more costly to buy permits, you will have an incentive to shift your production mode, your way of producing from dirty to clean technologies. But what this allows you to do is to understand when these shifts comes about, how rapidly the firms will react to this incentive by the policymaker. The diagram on the right is the case of a coexistence that we saw before, and you have the segments as in the previous diagram, but in this case, as the price increases, the segments move to the internal part of the cube, which means that the number of dirty firms decreases, and so you move from one parallel to the other until you bump into the wall at the end of the cube, so to speak. Because at that point, if the price gets sufficiently high, no one wants to be dirty any longer. So you just have two possibilities. Either you change your way of production and become clean, or you leave. If you stay, you want to be clean. Otherwise, you flee away. Okay, so I think it's time to get to the end and summarize what we found so far. It's a, as we usually say, it's a very preliminary, incomplete, blah, 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 but it's true. And so your comments are very welcome. But first of all, let me summarize the main results. What we do is a very simple dynamic evolutionary model to describe the behavior of different kinds of firms characterized by bounded rationality and imitative behaviors in a market that is both competitive and contestable. The idea is similar to the kind of other kind of model that we've done in the past, of biological competition model, in which different species compete for a common resource. Here we have two kinds of competition: across firms and within firms. Across firms, because all firms are in competition among themselves, because they produce a homogeneous good. So when there are new entries, they reduce the price, causing a damage, economic damage to the other firms. The second kind of competition is within a group, within the group of dirty firms, because an increase in the number of polluting firms increases the demand for permits, which increases the price for permits, which increases the cost for the other dirty firms. So making the strategy P, being dirty, less convenient. So basically, if other agents mimic my dirty choice is less convenient. Again. So what we do then, with this theoretical framework, we make numerical simulation to show that coexistence between firms is possible but very unlikely. And if this is the case, we have a global indeterminacy because we have an infinite number of attractors along the segment that I was showing before. And in the other cases, we have an attractive equilibrium without carbon leakage. So ETS does not induce foreign direct investment, does not induce carbon leakage, but also clean firms can exit the market. And that's what I was describing as the worst case scenario, in which all firms are left being dirty, either at home or abroad. Finally, as it is quite intuitive, the ETS can have a positive effect on eco-innovation. How? By increasing the price floor, this increases the number of clean firms and shifts the composition of the market from dirty to clean firms, which is saying policymakers, in terms of policy implications, have an instrument that can be a powerful instrument to modify the composition of the market and affect the dynamics of the market. So they can affect both the eco-innovation and carbon leakage using the price floor. I think I'll stop here and leave room to your questions. Yeah, very, very good point. I think it's you grasp an important aspect. The bounded rationality lies in the fact that I observe what the others do and mimic the others. And that's the imitative part. It's also bounded rationality because my choice is not based on simply the fundamentals of the economy. So if the others go wrong, I will also go wrong. Still, and I'm happy that you grasp this, we still have an optimizing behavior. And this is done on purpose. Let me try to answer with a broader view. Probably this comes from personal experience. When trying to make the model, I'm not so convinced of the perfectly rational guy that we describe in an economic textbook, But I think that most people are optimizing. So if I look at myself, I certainly take wrong decisions. I certainly, given the limited time at disposal, decide based on what the others do and try to mimic the others, but still I try to do the best I can. And so I still believe I'm optimizing, but at the same time, I'm bounded rational, you see? No, I'm happy that you find it intriguing, first of all. I agree with you that if anyone can be close to the Homo economicus is the firm. On the other hand, even working with the firms and working with the firms, with big companies on the EU ETS, for instance, I must admit that I believe they behave imitatively quite a lot. And we have just concluded a project on the EU ETS, and Caroline actually knows about it. And I had the opportunity to work with, or to collaborate, to discuss the topic with big companies. And I think that there is a lot of I would say, rule of thumb in any case, even with the biggest company. Maybe that's my perception, but that's how I see it. Carol? So you are talking about the permits market only, right? Well, in this case, the permits market is affected by the behavior of dirty firms. But the behavior of dirty firms is affected by the profits of the other kind of firms too. So, as you said, there are three forces going on, because if dirty firms find that the other strategies are more profitable, they might follow the others, and this might basically empty, so to speak, the market, leading to the end of the market, in a way. But here there is a sort of inner incentive for no, it's not this one. Anyway, there is an inner incentive for dirty firms to replicate themselves. Because consider the case in which the number of dirty firms decreases. This decreases the price of tradable permits. But if that's the case, firms will find more convenient to be dirty. And so the other NP and PP firms might decide they might decide to change their strategy and say, okay, why don't we simply buy the permits? The price is below 5 euros per ton, for instance, as it was in the EU ETS. And so when the price decreases, there might be an incentive to buy permits again. Now, I know that in this historical moment, we are fortunately on a rise of the price of permits. But we have seen price going down, and this might also have helped the rise again in price because more people were buying travel permits. So this is also the reason why we find two kinds of equilibria, I guess. That's my guess. But we find equilibria with without clean firms or without carbon leakage firms. But we don't find attractors without dirty firms. Why that's the case? Because the dirty firms don't disappear. Why they don't disappear? Because when the price goes down, they will go up again. That's my intuition of the results that we found so far. One more thing I would like to say on the policy side. This is a market, a special market, if you want, the ETS, where we would like the market to disappear at some point. We would like the price not to go to zero, become very high, so that everyone is convinced that it's not convenient to keep using a dirty technology. It's quite unconventional in this sense as a market. But what we found here is that this is not easy to realize. And probably we have to work pretty hard on the price floor if we want to convince people that really that's the case.
But in your model, the price floor then makes the carbon leakage.
On the other hand, yes, because we also consider this possibility. On the one hand, it can reduce the dirty firms, but it can also convince you to leave, to flee away. And that is why, as you know, from the policy viewpoint, I'm working on linking, trying to convince that if we don't have the same price everywhere, or at least ETS is everywhere, then we run into a risk of the third kind of firms going on. Yes, please.
Clarification, maybe there is something I didn't fully get from the model, but when you talk about the dynamics, we have that firms respond to own profits and not to the profit differential.
Yes, yes.
Fully competitive market, one may expect that firms just go to the largest profit in the three available.
I agree. That's one point that we are discussing with my co-authors, because in another paper, as I said, this is built up on other papers in which we studied sanctions or only eco-innovation. We consider that possibility. Now, the fact is that we have extended it to a three-dimensional framework, and to start with, we find easier to work this way. But you're right. On the other hand, what you are suggesting implies more rationality, if you want. And so it's more in line with being bounded rational to focus on one thing at a time. But it's a kind of...
You can think of some kind of barrier that makes it not possible immediately for firms to move from one status to another.
Yeah.
For example, but this would mean that the market for some reason is not perfectly competitive or is
Yeah.
that you can justify that.
Yeah, you're right. There could be some rigidity of the market that justifies this assumption.
You consider in the lead option, a fixed cost, which is a sunk cost, in order to produce without any regulation. However, if you produce abroad, you need to come back to sell your good. So, is it possible to consider, I don't know if the complexity of your model allows it, but to consider a different variable cost compared to the other options. So, I have higher a fixed cost, so no ETS cost, which is variable. However, I have also I have also an increased, a greater variable cost because I have to transport the goods to the domestic market to sell my good. It's
Okay.
a sort of barrier, additional barrier, as you like.
Okay, thanks. We also thought of making the last part as a variable cost. We were discussing again with my co-authors on this. We went for the fixed cost also because of the complexity in analytical terms, but this doesn't mean that we should not or could not consider this trying to solve it numerically. There was something else I wanted to tell you, and I forgot. The incipit was too long. Variable cost, well, I'll answer later, I guess, because, so your idea is that, yes, exactly. What we don't need, in a way, is to have transport costs to bring the goods back, in the sense that you may consider this market as a global market of the homogeneous good. So you go abroad to produce, but you don't need to sell at home. You can sell anywhere in the world. So that's how we see this market. But this doesn't mean that we could also consider a variable cost. Sure. This is actually generally the real reason why you move. It's more the lower wages than environmental regulations. But here we try to focus only on environmental regulations to see the effect.